Great clappers. All right, next up, Ed Parsons from Google. Ed, wow, well done on your screen sharing. All right,
Oh,
over to you.
thank you very much. It's almost as if I planned it. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Ed Parsons from Google. Although I want to make it very clear that my conversation with you today is me talking in a personal capacity, and the presentation I'm going to be making isn't the gospel according to Google in any sense. Not that I will disagree at any point with what Google is doing at this point in time, but the comments, particularly towards the end, are my own rather than a corporate view. So, I mean, the first thing to say really is we are living in extraordinary times. It feels like we're all extras in a movie. I spend my evenings walking around Richmond, the area in London where I live, and I see a few foxes, the occasional badger, but very rarely do I see anybody else walking. It's very strange to live in the world that we do. There's been huge changes to society, and if you think about it, the COVID outbreak is fundamentally a geographical problem. It's about the spread of a disease, and a disease that spreads by person-to-person contact, and those people are in particular places. That said, here in the UK, and to be honest, probably pretty much everywhere else around the world, our decision makers have been making lots of decisions, huge decisions, you know, that they would never have dreamt of making just a few weeks ago based on very little data. And data clearly is always going to be key. It's something that we all demand in our business lives. We probably demand in our personal lives, but in this outbreak, in dealing with this crisis, we've been, I think, fundamentally lacking in data across the board. And I think in time, when we come back to look at this, it will be one of the changes. One of the things that we will need to do differently next time is to have more data up front. Perhaps not be reliant so much on models that are very sensitive to their initial parameters if the data you're feeding them isn't particularly robust. So, not surprisingly, Google and many of the technology companies over the last month or the last couple of months have been asked by agencies around the world, of government agencies, to make information available that will help in terms of the management of the crisis. The first of these I want to cover is the mobility reports that released a little over a month ago now. I'm going to cover these in not a huge amount of detail. If you want to find out more, I recommend you go back and you listen to the GeoMob podcast I did with Stephen earlier on. I think we covered this in considerable detail. But the idea is that you see somewhere like this. This is my local railway station here in Teddington. And normally, you'd imagine that that place would be bustling even at this time in the evening. You know, where are the commuters? Well, normally you might pull up Google Maps and you would see on Google Maps the place page, and pretty much for everywhere around the world there is a place page similar to this with a little graph on the bottom that shows you how busy that place is at this point in time compared to what it might be normally at an average point in time. That information comes from users of Google Maps who are contributing information. They've opted in to share their location history, and we can use that data to sample how many people are at a particular location at a particular point in time. Obviously, this is quite useful now when it comes to managing the lockdown, or managing how well we can keep people from congregating in particular places. So there was much interest from government to make this data available. Particularly, there's many calls for an API that would allow you to go in and look at that graph and analyze the content that was there. So we approach this with a perspective of, yes, clearly making this information available would be useful, and we want to be able to help government agencies in doing that, but we need to make sure we do that from a privacy protecting point of view. So the approach that we took was to take the location history data that people had opted into and apply techniques called differential privacy, which is in effect adding noise to the data to the extent that the content from an individual in that data set is removed. So it's impossible, in effect, to identify an individual's information within the data set. And this can be mathematically proven. It's a statistical technique that you can apply, and you can actually calculate the value of differential privacy you have upon applying a particular technique to guarantee privacy. So in this case, we're very confident that the information that is produced, there is no concern, no issue getting back to an individual, mostly because we're working at a very large scale in terms of both spatial and temporal resolution. So we look at relatively large areas over relatively large periods of time, so it's impossible to identify individuals when we've added the noise as well. And this is the information that was produced. You've probably seen these graphs showing you, compared to the baseline, which was information from the beginning of January this year, how fewer people are going to these various locations for various geographical areas around the world. So this is a global data set. It's updated probably every week now, or at least every few days, with up-to-date information. And it allows you to track, hopefully, things like this, where you can see that the number of people using a transit station or transit stations across, for example, in this case, London, had been reduced by over 70% compared to where it was in January. So the big concerns we were thinking here, and much of my talk this evening is going to be about these ethical considerations, is, well, what did we have to think in terms of managing privacy? What was the appropriate use of that location information? Clearly, it wasn't to release information at a granular level that you could potentially identify individuals. We also wanted to avoid misleading insight. So it wasn't valuable in making information available about, for example, hospitals or medical facilities. We didn't want people coming to this and saying, well, there's no point me going to the hospital because the hospital is really busy or not particularly busy. And clearly, who should have access to the information? We wanted to do this in as open a fashion as possible, with the idea that, yes, this was largely for consumption by public agencies, by people that were responsible for the policies in terms of managing managing the lockdown process, but we also wanted to make it available to the general public so they could see the data that was being used as evidence. So we made sure that we produced the data in as an accessible format as possible. And we did initially get some criticism for just producing PDF reports as opposed to producing raw data. We recently changed that. You can now get CSV files that show you these percentages. But we were very conscious of the fact that, under no circumstances would raw data be made available. And then finally, and this is a key point that will be a recurring theme, I think, this information is only going to be made available for the duration of the crisis. As soon as, hopefully at some point in the near future, we can say, well, normality is almost restored, we will no longer produce these data sets. So that was the hot topic, I guess, of about 3 weeks ago, but obviously things have moved on. What everyone is discussing at the moment now is contact tracing, or exposure notification, as we prefer to call it. And, I would say probably 3 weeks ago, everyone was an epidemiologist. Now everyone is a Bluetooth software stack engineer specialist, or so it seems if you read the mass media or the newspapers. I don't necessarily agree with that, but let's carry on. So what is contact tracing? The best description I've seen of this comes from a website, a software process you will maybe have heard of called DP3T. Which is a larger group of academics and engineers that are putting together the decentralized approach to doing contact tracing, if you've heard of that in the press. They put together this very nice graphic that describes what contact tracing is. And although in the press there's been a lot of focus on the technological solutions, whether you use a centralized or decentralized approach, actually contact tracing has been something that's been going on for hundreds of years, and it's still, and in the future, it will still remain a largely human process that will have people phoning patients up and talking to them and trying to understand what's going on, where they have traveled once they have been identified as someone carrying the virus. And it's a long complex detective work that, even though technology is now something that we discuss about a lot, technology is only going to help that process along. It's not in any way going to replace the importance of that human contact tracing, and indeed, perhaps even more importantly, the testing that is going to be needed to say whether someone actually has the virus or not. For any form of contact tracing to work, particularly if you're talking from the perspective of, when does a technology based on a smartphone become useful, most people talk in terms of having a user base of between 60 and 80%. So you want 60 and 80% of mobile phone users to have the app running on their phone for contact tracing to be in any way useful or reliable. Now, that doesn't sound very much, I guess, but to give you some perspective, in the UK, 67% of handsets have got WhatsApp on. And WhatsApp is probably the most universal cross-platform app there is. And it's only got to 67%. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge to get there. Clearly, these apps have been out for a while. They originally came from the East Asian countries that were impacted by SARS originally. This is the example from Singapore. It got to about 20% of smartphone users in Singapore. Wasn't seen as a great success. So a few weeks ago now, amazingly, Google and Apple came together to produce a different approach to doing this. And the key here is to make sure we can do whatever we can to drive up that adoption number. That's the real driver behind this. If it's built into the common mobile phone platforms, there's a greater likelihood of getting to those high percentage levels that contact tracing will work. So there are some key design considerations that Google and Apple follow. That the process must be opt-in. You should have always the choice of not partaking in contact tracing. You should be able to switch it on and off as much as you want, whether you want it on all day or want to switch it off at evenings or whatever, you should have that choice. No identity information should be presented clearly, nothing that you could use to identify an individual. That includes the phone ID, telephone number, anything along those lines. And for this forum, no location information, absolutely not. So the mechanisms that both Apple and Google are introducing prevent you from using location information if you're going to be undertaking contact tracing. How it works, and there's no simple way of describing this, but I'll do my best. So imagine you have two phones. Both of those phones will every 15 minutes or so be generating an ID that's specific to that phone. It's generated using cryptography, and every 15 minutes or so, that phone changes its code and rebroadcasts it. So everyone will have on their phone an app that's running in the background, generating these keys and broadcasting them using Bluetooth LE to any other phones that are nearby. The phones are also, at the same time, every day or so, connecting to a central server, and indeed there is a central server in the Apple Google solution as well, and checking at that central server for the IDs of individuals that have had COVID diagnosed. And then, and this is the key difference, if you download that listing and you can match that on your phone with some of the IDs that you've picked up as you've been moving around, that match is made and a dialog box pops up and tells you need to do something. You need to go and get medical advice because you've met someone that has had COVID. That's the key difference. The decentralized approach, the matching is done on your phone. The centralized approach that the NHS here is following, the matching of codes, matching of those keys is done in the cloud. This is very much privacy preserving. We said there needs to be explicit user consent to make this work. No user information is collected, specifically definitely no location data. All of the keys remain on the phone. Positive tests aren't shared with Apple or Google. It's only available to public health agencies. So this is a whitelisted application. For it to appear in the App Store or the Google Play Store, it's only going to be coming from a government agency that Google or Apple recognize. And really importantly, At the OS level, the applications can be disabled at any point that Google or Apple chooses to when, for example, the epidemic has finished. That functionality will just stop working in people's phones. At this point in time, where we sit today, it's an API, which means it's something that apps have to develop. You have to build an app around this, and here's some prototype screens for what that might look like. At a later point, later on in the summer, it becomes part of the operating system. So it will be working in Android, in iOS all of the time, actually regardless or not whether you have downloaded an app from your national health agency. If the contact matching is made on the phone, a dialog box will pop up and suggest you download an app or you get in contact with health professionals. Okay, so this is really what I wanted to talk about. In times of emergency or crisis, there are no easy options. We do things now, and we will be doing things now that we wouldn't normally contemplate doing. It's not a case of choosing the best option. It's a case of choosing the least worst option. There are no easy answers. There are no, in many cases, absolute answers either. There's a lot of discussion around taking centralized or decentralized approaches. Actually, this is quite a nuanced debate. Clearly, there are fewer risks associated with a decentralized approach. But then, to be fair, there are epidemiological reasons why you might want to centralize the approach. It's complicated. And how do you know if the app's users are representatives of the population if you don't know who are those users? There are all sorts of ethical questions in terms of the use of technology that are difficult if you don't know who your users are as well. So, there are lots of really complicated gray areas. Clearly things that we need to be concerned of, and this is the reason why I put up this fire alarm box, is that it's very easy to make decisions in times of crisis that you then look back on and perhaps you wish you hadn't. If you think about all of the security concerns that emerged post 9/11, many of those perhaps, if we were looking back at those in the past, we might not have thought were a particularly wise choice. So it's very easy in these times of crisis to make decisions because it seems to be the right thing to do in the short term, but it's often difficult to then, I suppose in simplistic terms, put the toothpaste back in the tube. That's why I think the technology providers in particular have taken a very conservative approach to doing this, very privacy protecting, recognizing the fact that, yes, these are not easy times, but as I said, we can make decisions in the stress of the moment that perhaps we might look back on and regret. That said, I said, there are no black and white answers here. It's not as simple as the press or the Twitter sphere may make it appear. These are nuanced decisions that our policymakers are having to make. Technology is playing a small part in helping this process, and I think it will have an important but relatively small role to play. I think there's lots more analysis that we can do later on to really understand what's happened when the data has become more available. So an ethical view rather than a technological view. I hope you found it useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed. Very, very good. Stephen, let's dive into the questions. I have several, but I think you probably do as well.
I've got a question which you sort of half answered, but I'm going to just press you a bit. Derek Reethans asked, NHSX has not gone with the Google, Apple stroke D3PT approach with the view that they wanted to have doing the matching on a central server because otherwise they'd lose insight into how the disease spreads. And I'm guessing that revolves somewhat around location.
I'm not completely. From what I've understood, listening to some of the folks from NHSX, they're interested in the network graph. They're interested in more how the spread occurs through the population, not necessarily where they are. As I understand it, the app is collecting postcode area data, which is still very, very large. You know, you're looking at 20, 30,000 people share a postcode area. So I don't think it's primarily driven by location data. I just think they want to do, you know, more analytics. That's their choice to do. You know, it's not the approach that we necessarily would advise, but hey, that's up to them.
Okay, and I've got one more question for you, which was, do you think people understand that once they've opted into location sharing, they're sharing their location on a pretty continuous basis?
No, I don't agree with that. And I think, you know, we need to be very clear here that in terms of contact tracing, none of the applications in Europe, I think, apart from Norway, require you to use your location data. Certainly the NHS app isn't specifically asking for location data.
No. I think the question was about, in the first part of your talk, when you were talking about the, you know, the community.
The mobility data, yes.
The mobility report.
Again,
those are based on people opting in to share their location history with Google.
Yeah, you opt in, and every week, every month or so, we send you an email to say, hey, remember you've opted in to sharing this information. So, you know, we believe there's a lot of visibility there for doing that, and you have a lot of control over whether you're sharing the information or not, and you have a lot of control over how much of that historical information is maintained. And we are on an almost a month-by-month basis, reducing the time that data is held automatically and deleting it unless you ask us not to.
Right. And I've got a last question from Alistair, which is, he asks, I like this question, why do people so jealously guard their location when they're delighted to share what they eat, who their friends are and family, etc., etc.?
So, that's a very good question. I think partially is because all of this is relatively new. And I think, you know, part of my wish to talk about this as often as we can and to bore people senseless about talking about it is that I think we do as a society need to understand what the potentials as well as the risks of having this sort of capability is. And you know, suddenly this has all become visible to everyone under this sort of a crisis, which means that we can't necessarily, you know, take rational decisions around it. But, you know, I would like us at some point in the future to be able to have those conversations and actually understand, you know, what we do when we share location data. What does it mean? What are the pitfalls, but what are the benefits?
Okay, that's great. Ed, thanks very much indeed. And back to you, Ed Freyfire.
Yeah, I have one more question that came to me, which was, for the contact tracing, what handsets are you targeting, and what about people who have old handsets? Who pays for the data transmission? You know, what happens if the handset can't run this? I mean, there must be many issues there.
There are a fair few issues. I think, you know, both ourselves and Apple have tried to make this as universally accessible as we can do, obviously recognizing the fact that this is only for people with smartphones, and that in itself is a limiting factor. But basically, you know, if you've had a new smartphone, you know, in the last 6 years, this will work. It will work when the new releases of both iOS and the next version of the Android Play services is released within the next week or so. It's not something that exists yet today if you're looking for the Google and Android approach. So, you know, it will come. And in terms of the network and the power consumption issues, because it's just using Bluetooth LE, and Bluetooth LE is not the normal Bluetooth you think of, but it's the Bluetooth LE the Bluetooth that makes, for example, Apple AirPods work. It uses very little energy. It sits largely in the background, and it's not consuming any of your network in terms of your mobile network until the point that you want to report. Downloading the keys that you might do every day to say the people that have tested positive, that's a relatively small data set.
Okay, thanks.